When one thinks of a world's power system or magic system, a list of rules is inherently implied. There's a system to madness, a universal set of conditions that are followed to do these extraordinary feats in the universe. But that's kind of opposite to the centuries of mythology that brought us to the fantasy of today. The gods of yore were just that, gods, with no limits or systems to follow. Sure, some were weaker than others, their powers weren't always omnipotent, but it always came naturally to them. Training for your power, or channeling your power through objects, or even acquiring your powers through external events were not prerequisite. Oftentimes, these mythological figures were just born with their unique set of abilities, whether it be superhuman strength or blistering speed. Modern mythological figures, such as superheroes, don't necessarily follow a power system either, or at least they didn't at the start. Superman was meant to be as close to all-powerful as modern storytelling conventions would allow, in order to maximize its catharsis and to keep the tone light. Newer Superman stories follow the soft magic system that is solar-powered Kryptonian might, and that, along with the creative use of kryptonite by villains, allows writers to create walls around their fictional power sets. Kryptonians have mostly predetermined abilities that they all share, strengthened by the sun, weak to green glowing rocks, much as many of DC's speedsters gain their powers from and are limited by what they can get from the Speed Force. Perhaps these changes were made to make these heroes feel more human in concept, still normal people that are being altered by inexplainable phenomena that can be taken away, and not people irreversibly turned into gods. Yet it's in DC's competition where we see a group of characters more human than any other hero, yet not at all hindered by the consistency of a traditional magic system. This is Power Systematic. It probably isn't necessary to explain to you who the X-Men are. Marvel's former premier superhero team, before Disney industry planted the Avengers to take their spot, are as ubiquitous to the superhero genre as they are unique to it. X-Men as a franchise I would best describe as 30% comic shenanigans, 35% soap opera, and 35% unsubtle metaphor. Of course, those comic shenanigans include superpowers, and this team comes with a power system to boot. One that we will be calling the mutant gene, or the X gene. In the shared Marvel universe, any person has the chance of being born with a mutation, which is basically just a superpower that ranges wildly in usefulness and generally only affects you and things you interact with, except when they don't. Really, it's a generic way to hand-wave the fact that people have superpowers in this world without going through the trouble of writing radioactive accidents for each member of the team. The mutant gene is an ability-based power system, or so I've heard it called, meaning that no two users of the system have the same capabilities or limitations. This type of crackpot approach to abilities is common in the superhero medium, where variety in characters and powers is half the appeal, in addition to generally making your world seem both more fantastical and mythical, and at times mysterious or unexplainable. Yet, I wouldn't go as far to say that every member of the Justice League is a user of the same ability-based magic system. At most, a few might share the same non-ability-based power system, such as multiple flashes using the Speed Force, but Superman's and Wonder Woman's powers, despite being similar, don't share at all the same rules. But neither do Cyclopses and Gambits, do they? Other ability-based power systems, some I will cover in the future like My Hero Academia's quirks and One Piece's Devil Fruits, at least have some shared properties, such as the possibility of awakening them or even their weakness to the sea. Yet the mutant gene is completely unbound by rules, capable of making you an all-powerful god or a victim to your own body. So what is it that mutants share with one another? Well, it isn't the comic shenanigans or the soap opera-esque melodrama of the X-Men that will allow us to answer that question, but instead that unsubtle metaphor. Unlike what is normally expected of a power system, mutants and the mutant gene as a storytelling device isn't used primarily to categorize or explain powers, but instead as a vehicle for metaphor. Almost ingeniously, the X-Men as a franchise applies the same divinely given approach to superpowers common to gods of ancient myth, But instead of it being viewed as a boon worthy of worship, the dehumanization is a source of fear and oppression for those that wield it. Mutants are always the victims of their surroundings and of the humans that coexist with them, oppressed and marginalized at every turn. An aspect of the mutant gene that is meant to act as a rotating metaphor for a wide slew of real-life minority groups and social movements. A large-scale use of analogy coined by fans and writers as the mutant metaphor. Before we get to that metaphor, however, I feel the need to speak on the systemic part of this power system, i.e. the objective facts on what the X gene is and how it works, or more accurately, doesn't. I don't want to harbor too long on this topic. After all, mutants in the Marvel Universe exist for a very different purpose than, say, key users do in Dragon Ball. But I am here to analyze and critique power systems, and this is certainly an aspect to critique. While I could spend the next eternity explaining Marvel cosmetology to you and how that fits into the creation of the X gene, I don't fuck with that shit like that. So all you're going to learn from me today is that the X gene is an evolutionary trait that, like all evolutionary traits, become more and more common in newer generations. A few decades prior to the present being whenever you're watching this, not necessarily when I record this, it's really confusing, but the Marvel timeline is always sliding along with the real world. So the XMen were formed about a decade ago in universe, which currently means in like the 2010s, I think. But when they were originally created, it was like the 60s. Anyways, all this to say that semi-recently, the X gene has started manifesting in more and more people, and normal humans aren't too happy about it. The X gene doesn't actually have any real rules, per se, though you'd be forgiven for thinking otherwise. It's impressive how a power system built specifically to have no consistency somehow manages to still be inconsistent. Inconsistent in their inconsistency, if you will. The name implies some genetic continuity, maybe along a family tree. After all, genes are hereditary. Well, that is in fact the case. Children of mutants generally are more likely to be mutants, but that does not mean that they are more likely to have the same powers as their parents. The X gene activates mutations in the body. It doesn't itself hold any generational information. Except when it does, which is often. In fact, so many children, siblings, and test tube babies share their parents' powers, or a combination of, that I and many X-Men writers thought hereditary mutations were just a canon thing. Maybe at some point they were, but no, Cable being a telepath like dear old mommy is a complete coincidence, in the same way that being a telepath does not mean you share some DNA with Professor Xavier. While confusing, it's really one's own fault for believing that a gene that can grant one control over the weather follows any biological logic. Sometimes the X gene is said to be carried by the mother, other times it's said to be carried by the father, but sometimes it's portrayed as being able to manifest in literally anyone, whether they have a genetic disposition to the gene or not. Mutants were at one point considered human, that stopped being the case. Some characters gain a mutation through experimentation, acquiring an X gene despite not being a mutant. No, this does not make them a mutant, as we've established that mutants aren't humans, and gaining an X gene doesn't stop you from being human, even if that's the only physical difference between one and the other. Remember when I said the X gene doesn't follow any biological logic? Well, I kinda lied. As much like real-life mutations, XMen mutations tend to come in groups of unrelated features. Nightcrawler has the power of teleportation, and unfortunately he also looks like if Satan ate that weird piece of gum Wonka was disfiguring children with. Many people thought this aesthetic mutation was because he was a child of Mystique, Blue, and Azazel, Devil. But hold on there, X gene powers are only hereditary sometimes, so this fan theory was proven to be wrong in a recent comic run where it's revealed that Nightcrawler wasn't actually born out of wedlock. And while all of this is infuriating to list out, if you needed me to tell you that comics written by dozens and dozens of dubiously qualified hands led to a mess of broken continuity and origins, then I hope it isn't a deal breaker, because we're going to see a lot more of it. In the pro-Wolverine propaganda films that are the 20th Century Fox X-Men movies, we see this scene where Iceman, real name Bobby Drake, reveals his mutation to his family, the whole thing being framed like a child coming out to his parents. So much so that Bobby's mother's dialogue is actively satirical to that type of conversation, her asking Bobby when he knew and assuring that they still love him. It's accurate even to the incel brother calling the SWAT team to enact their justice by violently dispatching anyone the straight white man finds mildly uncouth. Ironically, this trilogy of films would pair up Iceman with a younger Rogue, a decision that probably should have gotten Bryan Singer fired sooner. Bobby would eventually come out as gay in the comics, probably as reparations, but the X-Men's flirty relationship with queer identities continues far beyond that. Whether it be Wolverine's almost homoerotic rapport with Nightcrawler, or Wolverine's flirty relationship with Morph in X-Men 97, or Wolverine's throuple status with Cyclops and Jean Grey, or even some other stuff not related to Wolverine, mutants aren't shy to this type of sexuality liberation. Especially post-Krakoa Fuck Island, a mutant-only island where it was a rule that you had to be fucking all the time. But these instances are notably additional identities for these characters, ones that don't really interact with their mutant identities beyond the universal struggles with romance all mutants tend to face. I think if we want to see the mutant identity as a direct metaphor for queer identity, Jubilee in the original X-Men 92 series is a better example. Her introduction in the pilot reminds me a lot of rebellious queer Jews of the time, up to her parents attempting to send her to the mutant equivalent of a conversion camp. This thread is further explored as she helps her boy toy Roberto da Costa, later known as Sunspot, basically come out to his mother in X-Men 97. The analogy proved to not be as one-dimensional as previously portrayed, as this rich mother is seemingly accepting of her son, claiming to already know through her motherly intuition, a common phrase of more LGBTQ+ friendly parents, even if she wishes to keep the identity a secret for the sake of the family business. Which brings me to another aspect of the mutant metaphor that mirrors a common strife of the LGBTQ community: the idea of passing. Passing refers to a member of a minority group easily being confused for a non-minority. Much of the drama of the X-Men comes from the difference between a mutant like Storm, who looks human to the naked eye, and someone with physical mutations like the aforementioned Nightcrawler. This even extends to villains who deny their own identity as mutants for the reasons that be, though I have to admit, a whole lot of this reads somewhat hollow. Sure, Jubilee's origin story may read like a commentary on queer youth, but at the end of the day, they actively decided to not make her queer and explore actual queer struggles directly. I almost feel like this is why Bobby would later come out as gay, to make that scene in X-Men 2 not feel like parody. And also because he was definitely gay in that original comic run, the original Uncanny X-Men run, he was unsubtly gay. Even with more direct allusions to queer history, such as Sentinels being at times portrayed as divine punishment for mutants, much how the AIDS crisis was portrayed as divine punishment for gays, or how both the real and fictional identities are commercialized and politicized to seem inclusive, while laws further target them, read as a bit off to me. I think this is because of the inherent differences in what being a mutant and being queer entail. A big part of bigotry is its irrationality. Humanity may love heroes like the Avengers despite being superpowered individuals just like mutants, as long as they don't have the X gene. But this flavor of irrationality is not the same that befalls homophobes. A straight man being caught kissing someone of the same gender will be called the same slur as a gay man, despite their differing identities. Yet between the Thing and Colossus, only the latter will be called a mutie. The average human does not fear being perceived as mutant by their peers for acting beyond the borders of traditional masculinity, like men in the real world fear being perceived as gay. There's a physical, passed-on mutant gene, and implying that this is anything similar to real-life gay people is problematic in its own right. The metaphor is incomplete. Mutations are a physical ailment, and while they tend to provide incredible supernatural gifts, they just as often come with physical limitations not too dissimilar to real-life disabilities. Many characters are actively impeded by their randomly assigned mutation, whether because of its lacking utility or inconvenience. Cyclops needs specially manufactured visual aids to stop their laser beams from shooting out every time he opens his eyes. Rogue must cover her skin at all times to avoid putting people in comas. Forget-Me-Not makes people, forget his existence. Like, after they meet him, they forget him. And when they stop looking, you heard the fucking name, you understand. Mutations can even provide behavioral difficulties, such as that time they took the adamantium out of Wolverine's body and his healing factor started turning him more and more savage, for reasons that I can only explain as misguided. And to avoid this section sharing the same descriptor, I tread lightly. Real-life learning and behavioral disabilities are nothing like the rage of Wolverine, much as real-life disfigurements are not necessarily parallel to Beast's ape-like body. Viewing mutations as an analogy for real-life disabilities is a can of worms you can't easily close. The fantastical elements of the X-Men doing nothing more than further uttering real-life disabled groups when comparing the two. Of course, the X-Men franchise has a lot of actual disabled representation, from Professor Xavier to Storm's claustrophobia, but the mutant metaphor is not super applicable to such. Of course, the parallels are there. Many mutants lamenting the world they live in, feeling that it's quite literally not built for them, feeling frustrated at all the things that come physically easy to others while difficult for them. Through this lens, one can even claim all mutants are disabled, since all powers tend to make a certain aspect of life harder. And while that is an interesting thread to unravel, it goes well beyond the realm of metaphor, which I think is for the best. Disabled audience members can see their struggles retold in the stories of their favorite heroes, whose uttered existence mirrors theirs, without going through the hurdles of simile. Many of the X-Men's mutations grant them some sort of impairments that are completely fictional in the objective, but all too familiar for many in the subjective. Mutants have formed various mutant ethno-states in the long history of X-Men stories, from Genosha to Krakoa to Asteroid M. Each time they are met with immense political resistance from other-world superpowers, which often lead to mass death, maliciously orchestrated humanitarian crises, or the threat of such. I won't bury the lead here. These most heart-wrenching and infuriating X-Men stories are not metaphors of real-life occurrences, they're critiques of the governments that caused them. I will not even begin to associate real-life genocides to the pages of superhero comics, so no, mutants don't work as a metaphor for the Jews of Nazi Germany or the Palestinians of present-day Gaza. But the fact that these stories remind you of the worst of humanity is intentional. Fear-mongering, hatred, stubbornness, and the most sterile, watered-down, palatable evil that the bureaucracy of fascist-friendly democracy can offer at full display in every scene between these up-and-coming countries and Big Brother United States. It's not secret what it is that these Marvel writers are criticizing, and while oftentimes this connection is up to the viewer to make irresponsibly easy to ignore, Magneto is always there to remind you that this has happened before. Remind you that this has happened in our reality decades ago. These stories are emotive, constructed to pull at your heartstrings to triumphantly make you repeat with Magneto, "Never again." A phrase included at times haphazardly when it's a topic the most in need of finesse. The humans in power, the ones that end up pulling the string, pulling the trigger, are often made sympathetic, either through optimistic personification or by turning them into pawns of a comic villain nothing like the villains that rotate in and out of office, leaving one to wonder, what comic villain made these politicians sign off on the acts of terrorism against the Middle East? Congo? The entire global South? Or do those not exist in this world? Is genocide in the X-Men universe only against the racially inclusive mutants, their white leaders, and the victims of World War II that we as a society parade like trophies? I'm being pessimistic, I know. But mass death, politically induced suffering, and unprompted military attacks aren't happening exclusively to spandex-wearing vigilantes. They're the horrors of the real world. These stories, when done right, are oftentimes my favorites, modern-day myths meant as cautionary tales, and the X-Men tend to do it right. X-Men 97's adaptation of the Attack of Genosha is incredible. But other times, the attack is somehow the mutants' fault, or a misunderstanding, or a reasonable overreaction. I also admit that these faults aren't completely the writer's doing, as these expectations, these bullets that they either seamlessly dodge or are unceremoniously killed by, are all the fault of the mutant metaphor's biggest misunderstanding. At one point in history, someone looked at Charles Xavier and Eric Magnus from the popular comic series X-Men and said, "Do you know who these two remind me of? Martin Luther King and Malcolm X." This person will be sent directly to hell. I think this is a good time to note that the mutant metaphor was not present when Jack Kirby and Stan Lee first created the X-Men. They were just heroes, a team of heroes, a novel concept. But as time passed and the stories got more and more intense, the characters' identity as these specially born individuals started taking cues from the minorities of our world. This would manifest itself in allusions to real-life racism, specifically to those that befell African Americans in the US, though that might be more due to its ubiquity in America, where these stories are written and produced. It is also the easiest connection to make when consuming X-Men media. Ask anyone the plot of the X-Men, and racism against mutants is a phrase that will surely be uttered. It's not an inaccurate description either. One has to admire just how boldly the mutant metaphor adheres to the modern history of racism in America, especially in a media landscape so scared to talk about anything beyond the not-so-liberating emancipation. The Friends of Humanity take inspiration from the white supremacists of the post-Jim Crow South. This group is a pillar of mutant hate that seeps into every aspect of daily life, much as real-life white supremacy finds its root deep in our Constitution. They run for office unimpeded, are allowed the benefit of the doubt in lieu of their numerous acts of domestic terrorism, and only grow to encompass hate for more and more non-human groups with each passing day. Their evil is fitting of a superhero comic, yet their malice is not an exaggeration of their real-life inspiration. Oftentimes, this group has the same racial profile as their IRL alternatives. Other times, however, they're all-inclusive. You can be white, black, Asian, Latino, alien, as long as you hate mutants. The mutant supremacist has no qualms against their colored brothers, even if they implore the same hateful rhetoric used to lead lynches against those brothers' ancestors. I don't chalk this up to the writers not understanding the implications of these decisions, as when it comes to finding a mouthpiece for evil monologues, they know exactly the demographic to cast. But as we'll see later, there is a recurring disconnect between these fantastical versions of race hate and actual race. Sentinels are giant mechs meant to police mutant kind, made for the alleged purpose of keeping humans safe. A group of mindless, heavily weaponized service robots that kill and or incarcerate a minority group on contact, deployed at and called to mutant communities directly. It doesn't take a political science major to see how these Sentinels are nothing more than mechanized cops, up to having the leading Sentinel repeatedly ignore any orders from other branches of government if it means continuing their bigoted form of lethal justice. They're even pink, like pigs. The X-Men already don't get along with the police most days, but the Sentinels are a good alternative to the militarized force that are the Boys in Blue, meant to maintain the status quo. Sentinels are one of my favorite antagonists in comics. Something about a mindless swarm of ultra-powerful death robots that suddenly and wordlessly come to your home to quickly dispatch of you perfectly encapsulates the paranoia many minorities in the US have when they see law enforcement, regardless of innocence. Sentinels, despite being a tool of humanity, is not actually in service of anyone other than the top percent, or at times just themselves. After mutant extermination in nearly every adaptation, the Sentinels continue to authoritarian rule over all, and if I stop and say, just like real life, every time comic villains reflect people in power, this video will take forever. Variants of Sentinels, such as Bastion in the newly released X-Men 97 show, tackle tangentially related themes, in this case taking jabs at the way the internet has placed hateful people in isolated echo chambers where they meet other like-minded individuals who recruit other ignorant people, all until they turn into cops, Sentinels. There's the classic X-Men villain, Mr. Sinister, an all-time baddie right next to Dr. Doom, an evil McBadguy who is a scholar of the past who committed inhumane atrocities and experiments on mutants in the name of science and his own self-preservation. a fate that befell many minority groups in the turn of the century, a heavy topic that makes his name sound even stupider. I could keep going, but in hopes of not feeling any more heavy-handed than I've been, a critique of many X-Men stories, I'll stop with the examples. The examples were also unnecessary. If you've watched this deep, then X-Men as a metaphor for racism is far from a novel concept. I'm also not gonna pull the mutants aren't actually a metaphor for racism on you, because oftentimes they are. It's just not a super good one. The X-Men comics have, for the vast majority of its life, built its mythology on references to the civil rights movement and its figures. Though unlike most bases, it was built after the auxiliary elements of superpowers and heroes were already established, and while the change into real-life allegory has been a huge boon for the franchise, it creates unavoidable pitfalls. Unlike the hateful stereotypes put on black people about their physiques or temperament, it is undeniable that many mutants have a physical advantage over the average man, and for decades writers can't help but portray these advantages as a danger to mankind and mutant kind alike. Of course, the evil mutants in need of an Uncle Ben quote are not representative of all mutants, much as Barack Obama bombing thousands of children does not condemn all African Americans, but unlike mutants, most humans couldn't bomb thousands of innocents even if they wanted to. It's hard to read mutant bigotry as equally irrational as real-life racism when even the virtuous Professor Xavier can't help but abuse his power at any chance he fucking gets. I understand that most mutant bigots in-universe don't actually care about the dangers mutant kind imposes, and hate wielders of the X gene just for wielding it, but it's kinda hard to ignore that the X-Men seem to beat up more mutants than they protect. I wouldn't want humans to be randomly assigned bombs that range in severity from a grenade to a nuke, and if that were happening, I wouldn't want to take many chances in stopping those bombs before they go off. So I get that this mutant thing is a hard situation for the X-Men to deal with. But it's a very unique one, not at all similar to the situation we're having over here in the real world. This is something that modern stories have deviated from, especially in the comics where most mutants live together in an island paradise, for as long as that lasted. And while that's all nice and good, if an audience member can watch your metaphor for racism and think, man, those racists kinda have a point, some of these mutants are inherently dangerous, you're doing a bad job. Mutants being portrayed as an evolutionary step above humanity also rubs me the wrong way, as it makes Xavier's want for coexistence read as a bit hollow, seeming like a temporary bid for survival until the rest of humanity catches up in the evolutionary tree. And while I know as a fan that the X-Men wish for coexistence regardless of how the X gene relates to normal humans, even if they aren't an evolution as many other characters believe, the mention of such a possibility is hard to shake. Especially when you are commentating on a struggle where the word evolution is often used by nationalists and oppressors to demean the minority mutants are supposed to represent. The metaphor muddies further when you consider how many mutants face actual non-superpowered racism, and the metaphor completely shatters when these bouts with racism are then removed from adaptations in lieu of mutant-only bigotry. But where does that leave us? Mutants aren't a good metaphor for queerness, disabilities, or even racism. At best misguided, at worst hurtful? Are Marvel's beacons of thoughtful commentary nothing more than a twisted caricature of what they represent? This is a possibility I have tried my hardest to reconcile with. For years, the X-Men have been my go-to superhero franchise, and that was in large part because of the mutant metaphor. The idea that the struggles of these all-powerful demigods are the same as mine was a tantalizing proposition, one that I feel like I have destroyed in the making of this video. But the more I think about it, the more I think that the issue here does not lie fully in the X-Men's failure to create a worthwhile piece of commentary, but in how we've labeled this overarching commentary in the first place. I was watching Lindsay Ellis's video on Bright, as one does, when she takes an aside to speak on Bright's horribly clumsy allegory for real-life racism, one that's a million times worse than anything the X-Men have ever come up with. In this section, she brings up J.R.R. Tolkien's disdain for allegories of all kinds, especially when it came to claims that The Lord of the Rings was a metaphor for any one real-life war. That immediately struck me, as Lord of the Rings is, against the writer's wishes, the grandfather of allegory and fantasy. Much as it created modern medieval fantasy, it also opened the door for the decades of insightful fantasy that would lead to the mutants we discuss today. Yet denouncing it as actual metaphor is, in hindsight, for the best, as the subtleties of the events of Lord of the Rings would make such an allegory fall far shorter than anything else in Tolkien's magnum opus. Similar to how the mutant metaphor crumbles to deep scrutiny. Yet it's impossible to deny that Tolkien's real-life experience with war dictated how his fantasy battles played out and the message they carried. And while the X-Men are often direct enough in metaphor that Tolkien would likely scoff in its mere presence, I think it works best beyond the barriers of allegory. And maybe that's what my analysis has really revealed to me. There are queer, disabled, and colored mutants, all those identities often separate from their mutations. Some have suffered through wars and genocides orchestrated on them for reasons unrelated to their X gene. The mutant metaphor is a misnomer, at least most of the time it is. Clearly the mutant struggle is meant to read as familiar to us, and these heroes relatable to the queer, disabled, and colored readers. Hell, at times they reference real-life occurrences through their mutant characters. But even then, those individual stories, these moments, work only when consumed isolated from what came before and whatever comes after, lest the allegory accidentally deliver the wrong message. Mutants aren't a metaphor for anything, yet many of their stories are. Mutants aren't a metaphor for racism, queerness, or anything of the sort, but instead a fictional minority group who at times face the same hate of real minorities in digestible, fantastical ways. We aren't mutants, yet from the injustices they face we see ourselves, and from their unending dedication and unwillingness to succumb to their oppressors, we can learn. I like to talk. Hope you like to listen. Hello, I hope you enjoyed that video. It was supposed to be a shorter video between the last 45-minute one and the next hour-long one that I was going to make. Turned out to be a bit longer than I expected, and it's going to be even longer now as I add this unscripted amendum. Is that a word? Amendment to it. For a few things. It's 2 in the morning now. I just finished editing, and I wanted a few things. Firstly, the video had a lot of talk about genocides and mass murder of indigenous people, ethnic groups, and I think I can't in good faith make a video about it without imploring you all to keep your eyes on the genocide currently happening in the Gaza Strip, in Palestine, in Congo, in Sudan. They have been suffering for decades, but public attention has elevated in the last few years, and the media, our governments are doing everything in their power to try and silence that. And so I want even my tiny dozens of people that are going to watch this video, that is enough. I will be having a Google Doc with a bunch of links for donations and groups that you can help, families that you can donate to. And if you can, I would implore you to do so.